Hello, and welcome to our presentation on the 6 components of a trauma-informed school. My name is Harrison Bailey III, and I am the principal at Liberty High School in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I'm also a doctoral candidate at East Stroudsburg University, and I have over 20 years of experience as an administrator.
My name is Nicholas Somatolidis. I'm one of the assistant principals here at Liberty High School, here in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania as well. I have over 20 years of administrative experience, and I'm currently a graduate student in the clinical mental health counseling program here at Moravian College in Bethlehem.
So, this presentation will do a number of things. First, we will provide a context for learning about trauma through a case study format. Next, we'll define trauma and give you some specific details on what trauma is all about. Third, we'll identify critical components to a trauma-informed school and specifically talk about it, how we put it into place at Liberty High School. Fourth, we'll describe service development, and then finally provide some helpful resources on how you too can do this as a leader.
So what is trauma? Trauma is when we have encountered an out of control and frightening experience that has disconnected us from all sense of resourcefulness, safety, coping, or love. So it's our central stress response system, our fight, flight, or freeze mechanism, which is something perhaps you have heard more often, and that affects our brain structure and our function. And so a traumatic event involves a single or enduring repeated events that completely overwhelm the individual's ability to cope or integrate the ideas and emotions involved in that experience. So cortisol and adrenaline, they wreak havoc and take a toll on our bodies and minds, which is what happens when you have a traumatic event or a situation. And some of these examples of what happens to us from a health standpoint is type 2 diabetes, cancer, heart disease. These are not natural and are caused by the unwanted conditions of toxic stress. So let me bring it a little bit more personal into the classroom. So an example of the effects on the brain. So a teacher reprimands or corrects a student in a pretty fair manner, but the student perceives it as uncomfortable, which triggers them, and the neurobiological effect of what they are feeling literally activates feelings of what you and I would feel if perhaps we were in the middle of a road or crossing the street and we saw a truck just barreling out of control coming at us. That would be extremely scary, frightening, and definite out of control experience. So what is toxic stress? So trauma can cause toxic stress, as I mentioned earlier. And so the impact of stress on the body and the brain are extremely harmful. But we do need a good amount of stress in order to grow and also to become more resilient. But we're talking about all day long, every day, which is toxic stress. And people with toxic stress are experiencing multiple negative stressors without the resources to cope. So let me explain it this way. There's between toxic stress and regular stress, which is good for growth. If you have someone to turn to, talk to, a friend, any type of support system, even though the conditions may be rough and even though it may be a heavy lift, you are not experiencing, according to science, you are not experiencing toxic stress. So toxic stress is a prolonged activation of our central stress response system, as I mentioned earlier, the fight, flight, or freeze mechanism, in the absence of a protective relationship. So you don't have a support or a buffer. And so the consequences of toxic stress can be emotional and physical, short and long term. So I like how through many of our trainings we have heard it's been said that the child may not remember, but the body never, ever forgets. And it does remember. So later on in our presentation, we'll hear about adverse childhood experiences and ACEs that cause different diseases, cancer, terrible sickness and illness in our bodies. And these scores, as we call them, ACE scores, are a stronger predictor of the risk of heart disease and other diseases than traditional risk factors that science relied and leaned upon, such as high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and smoking.
So, you heard Nick talk a little bit about this word ACEs. What are ACEs? What does that mean? And some of you may have heard this term. It's gained a lot of popularity over the past couple years. But ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And basically what that means is that there are significant negative experiences prior to the age of 18 that have some type of profound emotional or physical effect on the person. And this particular term came out of the Kaiser Permanente study that ran between 1995 and 1997. And it was primarily in California, but was repeated in multiple states after that. And this particular study, the first time, took 17,000 white workers, middle-class workers, and looked at the relationship between ACEs, right, or adverse experiences as youth, and compared them to adult disease, and mainly the big killers: heart disease, stroke, cancer, diabetes. And when you look at the study, what they basically found was that there was a direct correlation between the number of ACEs that you had and the level of disease, right? The likelihood that you would develop one of those major killers. So the more ACEs, the higher chance you develop one of the four major killers. Now, the ACEs that they looked at that time, the experiences that they looked at during that study, were prejudice, drugs and alcohol, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, physical or emotional neglect, poverty, divorce, mental illness, incarceration, witnessing violence, and domestic violence. Now, I'm sure that if we asked the question, how many of you have experienced any of those things, hands would go up. Maybe for one, maybe for two, maybe for a few more. But what we know, based on the science, is that the more of those that you would raise your hands for, the greater shot you have, right, of experiencing some significant disease later in life.